The truth about the Hitler Youth, no one explains. Some of the most familiar images of 20th century Germany are orderly, impressive, and strangely beautiful. Thousands of young faces in neat rows, flags moving in perfect rhythm, songs sung in unison, full of confidence and promise. To many observers, these scenes suggest unity, purpose, and national pride. They look like the harmless enthusiasm of youth, channeled into something larger than themselves. But history has a way of hiding its darkest mechanisms behind its most polished images. What appears disciplined can be dangerous. What appears innocent can be deeply calculated. Today's story is not about battlefields or political speeches. It is about children. It is about how a modern state learned that the fastest way to control the future was not through force, but through education, belonging, and belief. This is the story of the Hitler Youth, and how a generation was carefully shaped long before it was ever asked to choose. The leadership behind the system understood something fundamental. Ideas take root most effectively when they arrive disguised as normal life. An ideology does not need to announce itself when it can be woven quietly into routine. Long before children were old enough to question political authority, they were taught how to feel about it. Loyalty came first. Understanding was optional. After 1933, participation gradually shifted from social encouragement to obligation. What began as a popular movement became, in practice, unavoidable. Membership was no longer simply about joining an organization. It became a marker of conformity. To opt out was to declare oneself different, and difference carried consequences. Parents who hesitated often discovered that refusing participation brought scrutiny not only upon their children, but upon the household itself. In this way, the state positioned itself between parents and children, redefining where authority truly belonged. Daily life within the movement reinforced a carefully curated worldview. German children were told they were part of something larger and more important than themselves. History, they were taught, followed natural laws of hierarchy. Some people were born to lead, others existed merely to be guided. Obedience was framed as strength, while doubt was portrayed as weakness or betrayal. These ideas were not debated or analyzed. They were repeated until they felt self-evident. The real power of the Hitler Youth did not lie in its slogans, but in its repetition. Ideological messages appeared everywhere. At school, during recreation, in songs, ceremonies, and rituals. The same themes echoed constantly: devotion to the nation, loyalty to the leader, distrust of designated outsiders. Over time, belief became habit, and habit became identity. For many young people, the ideology did not feel imposed. It felt discovered, as though it had always been there. Social pressure did the work that punishment rarely had to. Adolescents are deeply sensitive to acceptance, and the movement exploited this instinct expertly. Wearing the uniform meant belonging. Marching in formation meant safety. To stand apart invited ridicule, suspicion, and isolation. Even those who privately questioned what they heard often learned to remain silent, because exclusion carried a heavier emotional cost than agreement. In this environment, conformity became survival. As the years passed, the system began to show its deeper effects. Children no longer merely absorbed the values they were taught. They began enforcing them. Cruel behavior toward those labeled as outsiders was normalized, even encouraged. Harassment and intimidation were justified as necessary acts of loyalty. Actions were judged not by their harm, but by their alignment with ideology. Compassion was recast as weakness, while aggression took on moral meaning. One of the most unsettling outcomes of this process was the way it altered relationships within families. Traditional bonds of trust between parents and children were gradually undermined. Loyalty to ideology was elevated above loyalty to family. Young people were encouraged to see themselves as representatives of the state, even within their own homes. Conversations became cautious. Silence became common. The private sphere shrank as political expectations expanded. At the same time, the system identified and cultivated a select group of youth deemed especially valuable to the future of the state. These were often the children of influential party members and officials. They received specialized education, harsher discipline, and constant reinforcement of their supposed superiority. From an early age, they were told that leadership was not something they earned, but something they inherited. Their confidence was encouraged. Their arrogance was tolerated. They were being prepared not merely to participate, but to rule. This separation created quiet tension among the young. Many ordinary members of the movement resented these privileged children, but the structure itself discouraged open conflict. Hierarchy was presented as natural and inevitable. Those who benefited from it learned to accept their status without question. Those who did not learned to endure it in silence. Girls experienced a parallel system with different expectations but equal control. Their education emphasized obedience, tradition, and preparation for domestic roles. They were taught that their worth lay in suitability rather than independence, in function rather than choice. At the same time, they were trained to absorb ideology deeply enough to pass it on to the next generation. In this way, the system ensured that its principles would outlive its leaders. As the regime became more entrenched, the boundaries between education, indoctrination, and surveillance continued to dissolve. Children monitored one another. They internalized authority so completely that direct orders were often unnecessary. By the time the state demanded absolute devotion, much of the population was already conditioned to offer it willingly. Control no longer required force. It operated through belief. Only years later did some former participants begin to articulate what they had experienced. Looking back, many struggled to separate who they truly were from what they had been taught to become. For some, this reckoning was deeply painful. They realized they had not merely followed a system, they had lived inside it, shaped by it before they had the tools to resist it. One former member would later describe the entire experience as a vast psychological violation, an experiment conducted on an entire generation before conscience and critical thought had fully formed. It was a realization that arrived too late, but carried an enduring warning. The story of the Hitler Youth demonstrates how fragile independent thought can be when authority understands childhood. It shows that the most effective systems of control are not built through fear alone, but through belonging, repetition, and identity. When belief becomes routine, and routine becomes self-definition, freedom quietly disappears without ever seeming to be taken. When belonging replaces thinking, when obedience is confused with virtue, and when belief is repeated until it feels natural, societies can be guided without force. The most effective control is the kind people no longer recognize as control. History does not repeat itself in identical forms, but its mechanisms often remain familiar. Every generation inherits not only the lessons of the past, but the responsibility to recognize how those lessons were taught. Because once a state claims the minds of its children, the future has already been decided, long before anyone believes a choice is being made.